You grew up on cereal that turned the milk a color milk was never supposed to be. Saturday morning cartoons that nobody asked permission to watch, and a kind of freedom that would make a modern parent's stomach drop. You were outside until the streetlights came on. That was the rule. That was the whole rule. Nobody tracked you, nobody scheduled you. You figured things out by doing them wrong first, usually in front of other kids who would absolutely tell everyone at school on Monday. And then, somewhere in your teens or early 20s, the world changed so fast it almost gave you whiplash. The internet arrived. Then it took over. Then the economy cracked. Then a pandemic rewrote everything again. You've lived through more fundamental shifts in how humans exist than most generations see in a full lifetime. And you did it without a roadmap, without anyone who'd been through it before, and mostly without complaining, because complaining wasn't really something your generation did much of. You just adapted. Again and again and again. And if you're honest, you're a little tired. Not broken, not bitter, just tired in the specific way that comes from being quietly resilient for a very long time, without anyone stopping to acknowledge that it was hard. If that landed somewhere in your chest just now, stay with me. Subscribe if this channel is new to you. We get into the real psychology behind how people are shaped, and this generation specifically has been misunderstood in ways that are worth finally talking about. Leave a comment too. I read them all. Because what's coming up isn't nostalgia. It's an explanation for why you are the way you are, and why the particular shape of your childhood built something in you that's genuinely rare. You weren't just raised differently. You were built differently. Psychologists who study generational psychology use the term cohort effects to describe how the specific conditions of your childhood wire your brain in ways that last a lifetime. A cohort effect is simply this: the things that were true about the world when you were young left a permanent mark on how you think, feel, and respond to stress. Your cohort, born roughly in the 80s, grew up in a window of time that was genuinely unlike anything before or since. You had a childhood that required you to be resourceful, and an adulthood that required you to be adaptable. Both at the same time, all the time, with no buffer. Here's what the research actually shows. Developmental psychologists have documented that children who grow up with significant unstructured time, the kind where you're bored and have to solve the boredom yourself, develop stronger executive function. That means better problem solving, more flexible thinking, and a higher tolerance for uncertainty. A 2018 study from the University of Colorado found that children with less scheduled activity showed measurably greater self-directed thinking than those in highly structured environments. You weren't just playing. You were building the operating system you'd need for everything that came after. And everything that came after was a lot. Here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody in generational conversation ever quite says plainly. You were the last group to have a childhood that looked like childhoods had looked for generations, and the first group who had to function as adults in a world that bore almost no resemblance to the one you grew up in. That gap, between the world that formed you and the world that needed you, is not small. It's enormous. And you crossed it mostly alone, because the people ahead of you didn't cross it, and the people behind you were born already on the other side. You did something genuinely hard, without a guide, without applause. Psychologists call this kind of adaptive experience post-traumatic growth, though in your case, it wasn't necessarily trauma in the clinical sense. It's the phenomenon where navigating serious difficulty, real disruption, genuine uncertainty, quietly builds capacities that easier paths don't. People who've been repeatedly asked to adjust don't just get better at adjusting. They develop a tolerance for ambiguity that most people spend years in therapy trying to find. You have it naturally, because life handed it to you whether you wanted it or not. Go back to the 90s for a second. You came of age in a decade that was, culturally, allergic to earnestness. Being too serious was embarrassing. Caring too much about the wrong things was social risk. You learned to hold your feelings at a slight ironic distance, not because you didn't have them, but because the culture rewarded composure and quietly punished sincerity. That's not nothing. That's years of emotional calibration happening during the exact window when your brain was most plastic, most open to being shaped. You learn to feel things and then manage them in real time, often without anyone knowing you were doing it. You got very good at being fine. Sometimes that's a gift. Sometimes it's just a habit that got mistaken for strength. Here's what nobody tells you about the 80s babies specifically. You are the last generation that knows what it feels like to be unreachable. To be somewhere and have nobody able to find you until you got home. To be alone with your thoughts for an afternoon not because you were meditating, but just because that was Tuesday. That experience, ordinary and unremarkable as it felt at the time, gave you an interior life that generations raised on constant connection are genuinely struggling to build. You know how to be with yourself, really with yourself. Not performing solitude for an audience, not documenting a quiet moment, just sitting inside your own head without needing to escape it. That's not antisocial, that's profoundly rare. The gift buried in all of this is worth naming precisely. You are genuinely bilingual in a way that goes beyond technology. You speak fluency in both patience and urgency, in both analog depth and digital speed. You can write a letter and you can build a meme. You remember what it felt like to wait for something, a letter, a phone call, a film to come out on video. And that memory lives in your body as a capacity for patience that instant culture can't manufacture. You don't need everything right now, because you remember when nothing came right now, and you were okay. That's a kind of wealth that doesn't show up on any list, but sits quietly inside you every day. So, you're allowed to feel the weight of how much you've carried. You're allowed to acknowledge that adapting, constantly, across decades of seismic change, was not nothing. You don't have to frame every hard thing as a lesson, or dress every difficulty up as growth. Some of it was just hard, and you did it anyway. You're not a forgotten generation. You're not too old for the new world and too young for the old one. You're not caught in the middle with nothing to show for it. You're someone who was forged in the last quiet decade and tested in every loud one that followed. That combination doesn't have a clean label, but it produced something specific and sturdy and genuinely difficult to rattle. The world changed under your feet, repeatedly, and you stayed standing. Not because it was easy, because you are, in some quiet and underrated way, exactly built for that. Tell me, what's the one thing from your 80s childhood that you think shaped you most? The thing you didn't realize was shaping you until much later. Drop it in the comments. And if this one felt like it finally said something true, subscribe. Next time we're going into why so many people who grew up in the 80s and 90s struggle with asking for help, and why that's not pride. It's something much older than that.